Hello, I'm Rupert Sheldrake, and I'm here with Mark Vernon to talk about memory.
Hi there, Rupert. Nice to join you again.
Good. Well, I thought as part of our series of talks on fundamental principles of nature, memory is one of them. And it's not clear how much memory is simply a psychological process that we have to explain in humans and animals, or to what degree it's a fundamental principle of the whole of nature. There's a sense in which everything has a memory or expresses memory, even things that seem very, very long-lived, like rocks and mountains, and things like houses, tables, and chairs, and so on, persist. And they're, in a sense, their own memory. You go back the next day and they're still there. There's a kind of persistence built into matter, which means that the past influences what's happening in the present. And it's a kind of continuous persistence. So we don't usually think of it as memory, but one can think of it as a kind of memory, and I'd like to explore that later. A more restricted view of memory is the psychological aspect of memory, the way we have habits which depend on what we've done in the past. That's one kind of memory, habit memory. When we learn some new skill, at first it's sort of conscious. When riding a bicycle, for example, you have to get on and you have to know which pedals to press and hold the handlebars, that kind of thing. And you have to think about it when you're learning a new skill. You follow instructions. But once you've mastered it, it becomes habitual. And a great deal of what we do and a great deal of what animals do is habitual. So there's habit memory. And then there's several other kinds of memory. Recognition is a kind of memory where you know that something's happened before. For example, you meet a familiar person and you immediately recognize them. You know them. And you recognize a place. And so recognition memory is another kind. And then there are several other kinds, but recalling is a more complicated one than recognition. And many people experience this in the common everyday situation. You meet someone, you recognize them, you know them, but you've forgotten their name. And recalling the name is a more active process. You have to call back their name. And it's not automatic like recognition. Recognition happens without any mental effort at all. You either recognize them or you don't. But recalling the name depends on having remembered it in the first place and calling it back. And then there's episodic memory, where you remember a particular incident, something that happened yesterday, or when you tell a story about something that happened in the past, you're remembering the details of a particular event. So these are all different kinds of memory. And the way in which they're understood has varied over the years, but they're still not understood within science. It's still a profound mystery. We'll come back to that. But I thought it might be a good idea to start with looking at how, in the Western tradition, philosophers have thought about memory. So I wondered if you could say something about the ancient Greeks and classical ideas of memory in the Western tradition.
Yeah, I mean, Aristotle is a good starting point for this because it feels like he lies behind a lot of what you've outlined, that kind of taxonomy of memory. For him, memory is really a kind of perception. It's a perception that looks into the past and sees what has happened. Now, that might happen in a quite deliberate way, like episodic memory, or recalling a name. It might happen in a more implicit way as well. There's a kind of embodied memory. So a habit, such as you mentioned there, is something that's been laid down in our body, and our body remembers that. And so, for example, the archer is one of Aristotle's examples. And when they know how to hit the target well, and be that come rain or shine, whether they're walking or running, it's a kind of memory that enables them to pull back the bow and release the arrow to hit the target through practice, through habit. And so it's linked to other things in Aristotle as well, therefore, like, for example, virtue. The kind of person you are will have a bearing upon the quality of your memory. And you can also develop ways of enhancing your memory. It is something you can interact with and train, like you can train your perception. And this, in the medieval period, actually developed into quite elaborate memory exercises. Quite a well-known one is imagining a house full of cupboards and drawers, and you can put memories into these various spaces, and then it's amazing actually how it works. You can recall far more than perhaps you ever thought you might be able to by traveling around this house and opening the drawer and seeing the memory in the drawer. People can even turn it into a trick. But it's all based on this idea that it's a kind of inner act of perception. And by looking, you recover a memory. In the early Christian period, memory was linked to other faculties of the human mind. It was seen as often as one of three key faculties. So memory is different, for example, from thinking, which is something which is much more in the present, and also from willing, desire, which is something that's more into the future. So it was sort of divided up in that way as well, that if memory was to do with the past, thinking is to do with processing what's happening in the present, and the willing, is to do with looking into the future. And in Augustine, for example, he also that links that sort of a pattern of the human mind, relates it to the divine mind, actually. And he sees how memory is a bit like the fundament, the ground, the source. So it's a bit like God the Father. Thinking is like the logos, the active principle in the present, making the present. So that's like the sun. And then the will is a kind of spirited desire that we have. And so that is a bit like the spirit. And so for him, that was a way also of kind of training and ordering the memory, thinking, and the will, to align them with a kind of deeper principle that's not just good for human psychology, but is in the cosmos as well. Yeah, and then the other element, which is perhaps is worth drawing in now, is I work as a psychotherapist, and it always strikes me how memory is deeply connected to both to place, but also to emotion, actually. So this adds an element that perhaps isn't so much in Aristotle, but I mean, people will have had the experience where, I don't know, they turn a corner, and in the instance of turning the corner on a street, remember what they were saying to the friend that they were walking with on that corner, there and then. But it was a week ago, and they can even remember the words that were said. Well, you listen to a piece of music and you remember where you were when you first heard that piece of music. So I think this sense of memory being a kind of perception and linked to place is echoed in that phenomenon, that experience that people will have had. But also in psychotherapy, memory is clearly very linked to emotion, and something that happened that carried a lot of emotional valence is something that's much more easy to recall in terms of memory. And conversely, emotions can actually overwhelm memories as well. One of the ways of understanding trauma is that it's a kind of emotion that has overwhelmed the memory of what actually happened. And people often hold on to the past in what's called screen memories, so that it's just one incident that has become enormous in their minds, and both remembers but also strangely screens the details of what had happened or what had happened before. And it's quite an interesting question to ask someone when they first approach you for psychotherapy, what their earliest memories are. And if someone doesn't really remember anything very much, I don't know, say before the age of 10, you wonder what's happened. Because typically people start having certainly episodic memories, memories of things and events from about the age of 3 or 4. Prior to that, memory, I think still happens, but it's much more a felt sense of what's going on in the body. And so people who have early difficulties in their life, they may not remember what happened, but they'll feel it maybe as a sense of dread, or conversely, if early experiences were good, as a sense of happiness and pleasure. It's linked to this emotional sense rather than what actually happened. So I'm very fascinated as well by how emotion and memory is very, very connected. But maybe that leads us a bit into the difficulty of accounting for memory in the modern scientific milieu. Where are memories stored? Are they stored at all? What's going on when we recount or recall a memory and so on? I mean, I know this is something which you've looked at an enormous amount.
Yes. The scientific study of memory has been dominated by a kind of assumption for most of the history of investigation, certainly through the 20th and 21st century. And that assumption is that it's stored materially, that memory has to be stored materially, because in a materialist worldview, everything's got to be material, including memory. And this was not the traditional view necessarily. I mean, Plotinus, for example, the Neoplatonist philosopher, thought that memory was a function of the soul and was immaterial. But the whole point of mechanistic materialism is to reject ideas like that and to try and say everything's material. And then the question is, what are the material memory traces? And the most common idea is that they depend on modifications of the nerve endings, that when nerves have been activated, that somehow they're changed and more likely to be activated again by similar stimuli. I mean, it's a simple, straightforward kind of idea. The trouble is that attempts to find these memory traces have failed over and over again. In the famous experiments of Carl Lashley, the American neurosurgeon, he cut out bits of brains of rats. He trained them to learn tricks. Then he removed different chunks of their brain to see where the memories were stored. And to his surprise, he found that it didn't seem to make much difference which bits you cut out. If you cut out the whole brain, of course, the rat couldn't do anything, but you had to leave some brain. But the amount of memory loss roughly corresponded to the amount of brain that had been removed. It didn't much matter if it was the front, the back, the top, the bottom, so on. And similar experiments with octopuses gave similar results, which is why the octopus researchers said that memory seems to be everywhere and nowhere in particular within the brain. And that led to the idea it's stored holographically, a kind of metaphor from the hologram, where the information is stored at all different places in the holographic photograph. So that this was in the 1950s and 60s and 70s that this became clear. But then people tried again. Stephen Rose, for example, trained day-old chicks to imprint on particular moving objects, and it's well known that young chicks and ducklings follow the first thing they see. They think it normally is their mother, but you can drag a balloon in front of them and they'll imprint on it and they'll just follow the balloon thereafter. And a particular bit of the brain in the chick became active when imprinting happened. And so Rose said, well, here we are, this is activated, this is where the memories are stored. But his colleagues then found that if you cut out this bit of the brain a day later, they remember perfectly well. So the memory traces again proved elusive. So then they said, well, maybe it's moved to different parts of the brain. So the memories could shift. This happens over and over again. Whenever people can't find them, they say, well, they must be somewhere else. Then there were some more recent studies using optogenetic methods where they genetically modify the organisms, usually mice, in such a way that when the nerve cell becomes active, particular proteins are activated, which you can, by shining fluorescent light, you can make them fluoresce, so you can actually see which cells were active. And then once you've got these particular green fluorescent proteins expressed in the cells, you can reactivate those cells by shining lights on them. So in this case, they actually create memory traces by making particular cells labeled and then reactivate the labeled cells. And this seems to retrieve some simple memories. So they said, oh, well, that proves it. But actually, they'd created the memory traces. They'd actually deliberately labeled these particular cells and reactivated the same cells. So in a sense, they're artificial. It later turned out that when you look at the actual cells involved, when you label the cells and look at them, when you see which ones are actually involved when the memory is retrieved, when a mouse remembers which way to go in a maze, for example, then some of the same cells are reactivated when the memory is recalled, but only about 10% of them. Other ones are activated, and the memory seems to have shifted. And so it becomes very hard to say, well, it's in those cells. And the most recent research, using extremely sophisticated electrodes implanted in mouse brains, has shown that when memories are laid down, you have a very complicated pattern of waves in the brain, of waves of electrical activity. And when the memory is reactivated, you get very similar wave patterns. So the memory seems to be related to these waves, but the wave patterns don't necessarily occur in the same place. They can shift around in the brain, and this is now called representational drift. So again, when they thought they'd found the memory traces, they're not actually etched into the nerve cells. It's a pattern of activity that's involved. It's not actual cells. So memory research has after years and years and years and huge expenditure and lots of ingenious experiments, is very frustrating for researchers because they just simply can't find or pin down these memory traces, which leads to the possible idea that the memories don't work that way at all. And I myself have long thought that memories don't work by memory traces. And I was very influenced by the French philosopher Bergson, whose book Matter and Memory, first translated into English in 1911, argues that memories aren't stored in the brain, that the brain receives the memories but isn't storing them, that the memories depend on a kind of causation across time, a direct causational connection across time, rather than having to have a material link continuously. And this idea was taken up by Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, who thought in terms of memories as prehensions, a kind of reaching back and grasping something from the past, but not being stored as memory traces. The philosopher Bertrand Russell took it up and called it mnemic, M-N-E-M-I-C, mnemic causation, a new kind of causation working directly across time. The philosopher Wittgenstein also took the view that there was no reason there should be traces. He said, when I recognize somebody, I immediately know I've seen them before. There's nothing in my experience that tells me there are traces inside my brain. That's purely a theory of memory. So there's always been a strand of people who don't think it's in the brain. And I think the evidence points that way myself. My own theory is the hypothesis of morphic resonance, that similar patterns of activity influence subsequent similar patterns across space and time. And that depends on similarity, a kind of resonance across time. And this hypothesis leads to the idea that since we're similar to lots of other people in the past, we may not just tune into our own memories, but to lots of other people's. There'd be a kind of collective memory. Each species would have a collective memory of form and of behavior. Indeed, from this point of view, the instincts of animal species, like spiders being able to spin webs without going to a web training school or class, they just instinctively know how to do it, baby spiders. That this is a kind of habit of the species, a memory of the species that's inherited collectively. Individual memory, on this view, would depend on the fact that we're more similar to ourselves in the past than we are to anyone else. So individual and collective memory differ in degree, but not in kind. So I generalize this view of morphic resonance to say that actually there's memory inherent in all nature, that when a crystal crystallizes, it's drawing on a collective memory of previous crystals of the same chemical forming and is sort of influenced by them. When a molecule or an atom forms, or when a protein folds up, all these processes at the chemical level are influenced by memory too, a kind of collective memory. And indeed, when this is taken in its most general form, this hypothesis leads to the idea that the so-called laws of nature are more like habits. The conventional view is that they were all there at the moment of the Big Bang, like a cosmic Napoleonic code. But in an evolutionary universe, which we've had in Western science since the 1960s, the Big Bang theory, with an evolutionary cosmology, why shouldn't the so-called laws of nature evolve as well and depend on a kind of memory, become like habits? So I'm suggesting that a lot of nature is habitual, and habits are unconscious in us, and there's no reason to assume they're more conscious than the rest of nature. So they're a form of unconscious memory. But there's also conscious memory, and both of them depend on morphic resonance. Now, I think this also helps to explain that single-celled organisms like paramecium or stentor can have memories. They haven't got nerves, they haven't got synapses, they're just a single cell. And yet it's well established, it's been known for over 100 years, that they can remember stimuli, they can habituate to familiar stimuli, for example. They have a memory. Plants can have memories too and can habituate. Sensitive plants can habituate to being repeatedly stimulated. So the memory doesn't just depend on nerves. It's generally recognized as widespread in the whole of biology, which suggests it's not simply a process to do with nerves. It's more fundamental. And I think it's yet more fundamental than biology. I think it's inherent in all nature. And interestingly, the idea that memory is inherent in all nature is not just about humans and minds and higher animals and brains. This view is quite widespread in Eastern philosophies, in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. And I know this is something you yourself have been interested in. And so I wonder if you could say something about Oriental, Eastern views of memory.
Yeah, just to say thanks for that. That's a tremendous sort of explosion of the sense of what memory might be. It's not just like a database that we kind of access like a computer, but is absolutely fundamental to our sense of connection with others and to the natural world as well. I mean, this partly connects up with what one observes about the link between emotion and memory, and that similarity. You mentioned there we're sort of most similar with ourselves, and so therefore that seems like personal memory. But similarity with others, emotional connection with others, is the way you would experience that. Seems to enhance memory as well, and then of course that can be a similarity across a species, identification with a species, and so on. So I, intuitively, that's another way of saying that what you're arguing there about morphic resonance kind of makes sense in terms of how we actually experience memory. Similarly, what I was saying about how memory and place are so linked, both actually going to a particular place and a memory returning, or using a kind of thought experiment, traveling around a place in order to stimulate memory as well. And this all seems to resonate very powerfully with what you're saying there.
Let me just add one more
Yeah,
thing to add to that, which is that the learning through emotion is actually very fundamental in animals. I myself have recently been doing some research with nematode worms, Cinerhabditis elegans, a small 1 millimeter long roundworm that's very widely used in biological research now. It has a very short generation time, about a week. And it's now known that you can train roundworms to be averse to particular chemicals or attracted to particular chemicals. For example, if you starve them in the presence of a particular chemical, for example, butanone, a ketone related to the alcohol butanol, then when they're exposed to butanone after that, they're repelled by it. If, on the other hand, you associate food with a particular chemical, for example, benzaldehyde, then they'll be attracted to benzaldehyde thereafter. So smell is, even in humans, a very powerful connector with emotions and with memory. But it's very fundamental in these small animals. And, moreover, if you expose them repeatedly to benzaldehyde over several generations, then thereafter, even without exposure to it, they retain this memory of being attracted to benzaldehyde. And this is a form of what's now called epigenetic inheritance, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. I think it depends partly on morphic resonance. The fundamental nature of emotion, sort of starvation, produces aversion, and food produces attraction. This is pretty fundamental. Attraction and repulsion are some of the most fundamental emotions in us as well as in worms. And these memory is very closely connected with them.
yeah, and I think the link there with smell, emotion, and memory. There's the famous opening in Marcel Proust's in Remembrance of Time Past. Where the smell of the Madeleine and the tea prompts this whole discourse on his early life, and it's not just the pure smell; it's the loveliness of the smell to him. So it's an attractive feeling in that moment, and the whole thing opens up. Another way of taking this, and to link back maybe to this idea of memory being not just something that we have, but that being inherent in reality. Just to go to the Indian ideas, but maybe first via Plato. You mentioned there Plotinus and the idea that memory is a function of the soul, and I think that's in Plato as well. And I think the way that it works in Plato is that memory is actually for him recollection, and not just personal recollection, but recollection in terms of the way reality is. There's the famous experiment that he does, or at least he relates Socrates doing with the chap Meno in the dialogue called Meno, where he tries to show that Meno can solve, in inverted commas, mathematical problems, not by working it out, but by recollecting the nature of things. And so in the dialogue, Socrates takes Meno through this sort of step-by-step act of recollecting things that then help them to solve the mathematical problem. And this is the idea, therefore, that a fundamental part of what it is to be human is to recollect and to remember what we've forgotten, maybe because of the I don't know, the business of everyday life obscures things from us, maybe because our virtues and the person we've become have cut us off from various kinds of memory. But again, I think it does actually connect with the sense of habit. Often Plato talks about in rather mechanistic ways these days, as if there's a kind of blueprint that nature is sort of born from. But I think that's really only since Francis Bacon that happens, and something much more dynamic is really in the original Plato. And so memory and feeling and attunement to qualities like what's good and what's beautiful and what's true, that is all part of what it is to remember, and to draw on memories which are held, ultimately in all things. which maybe takes us to ideas that one can associate with India, particularly in their origin. And of course, I think there was probably a lot of commerce between India and the Eastern Mediterranean, which means no doubt Plato too was shaped by these things. But maybe just to sort of leap into one particular aspect of the Indian understanding that I've been thinking about recently, actually, which is the role of memory in reincarnation. Because what you have there, say in the Buddhist framework, reincarnation is thought about in different ways. I mean, Plato too has an idea of reincarnation, which he calls metempsychosis. But in the Buddhist tradition, memory is in any one life, you kind of lay down memories, which are kind of habits. They're often referred to as karmic seeds. They're kind of attitudes, stances, the way that we are in the world, and that's remembered from one life to another. So certainly for the Buddhist, it's not that one particular person survives a reincarnation, but you as an individual have a sort of an opportunity, even a responsibility, to shape that which would get laid down through these karmic seeds, and then that will inform the person or the creature that's incarnated next. And tortuous, difficult parts of life, the suffering of life, the craving and the aversion, like you were mentioning there, these are called samkaras, and they're like knots or twists, which actually makes a lot of sense to me as a psychotherapist, because I think that right from the early stages in this life, we're reacting either with aversion or with desire, and so those habits kind of build up, and people can live a whole life shaped by the habits that built up from early life, whether they be useful or inhibiting suffering or sort of releasing. So that's a sort of one way, at least, in which memory is seen to be part of the very fabric of reality. Moving people across not just their own lives, but between lives as well. And it has this subtle twist that it's not the person. So maybe this relates a bit to, it's not, as it were, stored in the one individual, but is part of the milieu into which someone's born. And so maybe like a sort of morphic resonance shapes the way that person lives their life. And of course, the liberated or enlightened person gets sight of that in the Buddhist tradition and is so able to do something about that which they've inherited by memory, and to therefore move into a different future, and the one that would just be determined by the memory that they've inherited. Did those kind of ideas have an impact upon you?
Well, I was, when I lived in India for 7 years, as you know, and when I arrived there, I'd already had the idea of morphic resonance, but I found India a much more helpful environment to think about it, because instead of it seeming completely weird, the idea of morphic resonance, most Indian Hindus that I talked to just simply took it for granted. They seemed, when I explained the idea of morphic resonance, they were completely blasé about it. They said, oh, there's nothing new in this idea. Ancient rishis have said this thousands of years ago, that there's memory in everything, and so on. Because some Hindu and Buddhist philosophical systems generalize these reflections on reincarnation to the whole of reality, or everything in reality has seeds of memory or karma, which are expressed in all nature. So the idea of a memory inherent in all nature is pretty well taken for granted, I would say, in Hindu philosophy. When I discussed it it wasn't just Indians who'd studied deep philosophy for years. It was sort of ordinary people I met on train journeys, who they liked talking about big ideas, or at least they did when I lived there. And railway journeys, you've got hours and hours because the trains are so slow. So I found, almost everyone took for granted the idea that there's some kind of memory in nature. So in a sense, this paradigm of memory everywhere and in everything, which is implicit or explicit in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, is very different from the normal Western view, which is that the whole universe is amnesic, because it's governed by eternal laws which don't have memory within them because they're beyond space and time altogether. Rocks and things stay the same because of eternal laws, but we're moving more to this Eastern view, not just through morphic resonance, but through quantum theory, which shows us that matter isn't just brute, persistent stuff, like little billiard balls, and atoms were often pictured as sort of billiard balls and bits of stuff, but processes, wave patterns that repeat. And in a sense, an electron or a proton which just continues to exist is a wave pattern. Everyone agrees in quantum theory they're wave patterns, but it's a wave that just keeps going. And in a sense, you could say it's self-resonant, a wave propagating itself. And in a sense, that self-propagation of a wave, a process which is repeating itself, involves a kind of memory. The persistence of rocks and mountains involves a kind of inherent memory in the things that persist. That's why they persist. Because we can't any longer take for granted that they just persist because they're stuff. Matter is no longer seen, even in mainstream science, as just stuff. It's a vibratory pattern that repeats. And this repetition is a kind of memory process. So I think memory, far from being something confined to human minds or animal minds, is deep and inherent in all nature.
Yeah, and I mean, this would make sense if you're at all inclined to an idealist worldview rather than a materialist one. So the idea that the fundamental stuff of reality is more mind-like than it is stuff-like. And then that which persists is that which is remembered, that which is habitual. And I guess that at the ultimate level, everything is held in the mind of God. And so everything for its existence moment by moment arises from the divine mind. And the divine mind's faithfulness, as would be a kind of religious language that's used, is faithfulness to reality. That's where our security rests. That's the ground of our being. It has this kind of dynamic, lived sort of quality, and therefore, relating to that upon which we depend, and praising that upon which we depend because it gives us this life moment by moment. These all are very natural parts of the religious systems that would see the world in this way. It's not just God being a kind of deistic lawmaker who sets things off at year zero and then it just rattles along like a more or less perfect machine, but that rather our relationship to the divine is active and alive moment by moment, and because of who we are and that we persist is as a result of this energy, this presence, this place even that we have in the divine mind.
Well, I think that's a good place to conclude. Not only is memory fundamental to nature, it's fundamental to the divine, and indeed it's just fundamental. And I'm very pleased we've had the chance to think this through and arrive at that conclusion.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful subject, because when you ask how the attempts materialistically to account for memory are doing, and as you so brilliantly sort of outlined there, realize that they seem to stumble at every new attempt, but that needn't be a recipe for despair, because actually what it does is it takes you back to these older ideas, but renewed as well, and shows that a scientific subject like memory, so a part of, fundamental part of nature, does lead us into these wider perceptions and horizons once again, which is what we found several times now with discussing these things. So thanks very much indeed, Rupert.
Well, thank you, Mark.